Hello and welcome to Ahval Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on ahvalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm Ahval editor David Lepeska, and joining me today is Nicholas Danforth, senior visiting fellow at the U.S. German Marshall Fund, focusing on U.S. Turkish relations. Welcome, Nick, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Good to be on here.
We are speaking on Monday, day 6 of Turkey's offensive in Northeast Syria, which changed significantly yesterday when the U.S. announced that it would be withdrawing all of its troops from Syria, which led a few hours later to the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, reaching a protection deal with President Bashar Assad's government. Assad forces have begun entering formerly Kurdish-held towns near the border, according to reports. Nick, do you think Turkey views this outcome as a success? And how do you see the jostling for territory playing out in the days ahead?
It's hard to tell what would have counted as a success for Turkey. The stated plans for this operation were broad, were made on the fly when the U.S. announced that it was going to pull out. They involved things like resettling 2 million refugees in northeastern Syria, which many of us thought were impossible. They involved Turkey promising the United States that it would take control of ISIS prisoners, which was going to be very difficult to do. What's been difficult for a lot of us following these debates, following Turkish strategic thinking, is that there often seems to be a remarkable discrepancy between the stated ambitions of the Turkish government, in this case, carving out a large safe zone across northeastern Syria, and the somewhat smaller strategic objectives that they sometimes seem to have in the back of their head or under the surface. The suddenness with which Trump agreed to pull out of northern Syria suddenly left Turkey in the position where there were no obvious obstacles to it implementing its most grandiose version of its plans. And so in that sense, it was hard to know, so while it clearly it's not going to get the safe zone it wanted, it's not going to get to resettle millions of refugees. From another point of view, this isn't a bad outcome from Turkey. The YPG, instead of being allowed to develop some kind of independent territory, comes back under the control of the Assad regime. The United States is gone. There's no more U.S. support for the YPG. Set against this, of course, is the enormous damage to U.S.-Turkish relations that was done. And I think we'll see that playing out. We'll see that playing out in the coming weeks, months, and even years. Turkey's operation, ultimately, it got a small chunk of territory, and it did come at an enormous diplomatic cost.
Okay, we'll get to a couple of those other things, the refugee resettlement plan and the U.S.-Turkish relations, but in terms of the jostling for territory, you think it's pretty much done. Turkey will keep or Turkey-backed forces will maintain control of this area that they have now. There won't be any kind of further push and pull.
I mean, look, if I had to guess, and this is beyond my area of expertise, I doubt you'd see clashes immediately between Syrian and Turkish forces in northeastern Syria, but in the long run, I do think you'll see continued Russian and regime pressure on Turkish-held territory across the border in the northeast, also in Afrin, also in Idlib. Russia and the Assad regime have repeatedly cited the Adana agreement as a precedent for what the relationship they'd like to see going forward is. That means, according to the Adana agreement Turkey would have the right to execute limited cross-border operations, but of course there'd be no long-term Turkish presence in northern Syria. This is what Russia and the regime have been pushing for. This is what I think they're ultimately going to try to force Turkey to concede to.
As you point out, while the Kurdish entity along Turkey's border has been dismantled or is going to now be dismantled, it appears, and we've avoided this widely feared slaughter, the SDF or the YPG has not been militarily defeated. So many fighters, which Turkey still views as terrorists, will continue to live and potentially fight another day. Won't Ankara potentially see this as problematic? It seems like another clash would be inevitable, sooner if not later.
And the risk for Turkey now, right, is that the YPG, the PKK, is still going to be in existence. Syria and Russia supported the PKK for decades. Bashar al-Assad's father used the PKK for leverage against Turkey by supporting its operations inside Turkey. You could very much return to a situation where, it's now a card that the regime has to play against Ankara as it tries to retake all of its territory, again, in Afrin or in Idlib. And Turkey is now going to be most likely dependent on Russia as the only actor in the region who can restrain the Assad regime and can prevent it from using the PKK against Turkey.
Speaking of U.S. Turkey relations, Trump is now backing sanctions against Turkey and says there's a consensus forming in Washington around that idea. I spoke to an analyst for TRT World, Turkey's state-run broadcaster, earlier today who said President Erdoğan and Turkish officials are not terribly concerned about these sanctions, that security has to come first. This seems like a risky stance, considering that the last round of U.S. sanctions pushed Turkey's economy into recession.
Right. Turkey has continuously banked on the fact that it could work with Trump to avoid paying any price for antagonizing literally everyone else in Washington. There were many people who warned that this policy would only go so far, that at some point Congress would get increasingly fed up, Congress would take action, or that Trump, simply being fickle, as he did during the Brunson case last summer, might change his mind and might decide that he wants to go after Erdoğan and the Turkish economy. Certainly Trump having refused to take action over S-400 sanctions, which were promised, there is something surreal about him now threatening possibly going through with sanctions on Turkey for something he explicitly agreed with. On the other hand, this is exactly the risk that Turkey took when it put all its faith in Trump. Trump gave Erdoğan what he wanted. It became politically embarrassing for Trump. It's entirely possible that Trump will respond by throwing Erdoğan under the bus. He's done it plenty of times before, and plenty of people warned Erdoğan that this might be the result of his policy.
Well, here's what I don't really understand, though. If the whole sanctions idea was for Turkey's invasion of Syria and potentially clearing the Kurds from their land, why would the U.S. sanction now when the violence appears to be predominantly over?
And this was always the problem. Ideally, right, the United States would use sanctions as a tool to prevent Turkey from doing things that it didn't want. Its failure to effectively use sanctions to prevent Turkey from buying the S-400s, to prevent Turkey from conducting an operation in northeastern Syria, has put it in the awkward situation of now having to use these sanctions in a purely punitive fashion. I think that represents a failure of U.S. policy. At best, I think there are some people who might be thinking in Congress that now there are probably some people in Congress who are thinking that these sanctions will help make an example of Turkey, will help show that, Turkey didn't do what the United States wanted and is now paying a price for it. But as you said, right, Turkey viewed its operation in northeastern Syria. Turkey viewed its operation in northeastern Syria as a necessity for its security. Turkey presented the purchase of S-400s as a necessity for its security. It's very difficult to imagine Erdoğan backing down in the face of these kind of explicit threats. What I worry about is you're going to get a very unhealthy dynamic in which the United States continues to impose sanctions to prove a point. Turkey continues to ignore U.S. pressure to prove a point. And ultimately, U.S.-Turkish relations get worse and worse to no strategic benefit for the United States or for Turkey.
Yeah, to that point, responding to reports that Turkey-backed forces were deliberately surrounding U.S. troops last week, former top U.S. diplomat Richard Haass on Sunday tweeted that it's long overdue for the U.S. to give up the fiction that Turkey is an ally. The U.S. should withdraw all nuclear weapons, reduce its reliance on Turkey's bases, and so forth. What's your thinking on that? Is it time for that?
I think part of the problem is that Turkey, by focusing on Trump, has ignored the deep intensity of anger, sometimes even irrational anger, building towards Erdoğan and towards Turkey and every other branch of the United States government. And, a lot of things have been put forward, like kicking Turkey out of NATO. I don't think necessarily makes sense, but the very fact they're being discussed, the very fact that that's where the conversation is in Washington, is going to have enormous cost for Turkey, is going to have enormous cost for the U.S.-Turkish relationship.
Yeah, to some extent, it seems like it can only remain talk. The TRT World analyst I spoke to today argued that the U.S. really has no regional alternative to Turkey in terms of placing its nuclear weapons and military bases Would you agree with that?
Well, you have a lot of U.S. analysts explaining in very reasonable detail why Turkey has no reasonable. But you have a lot of very astute U.S. analysts who, for the past several years, are explaining why Turkey has no alternative but to work with the United States. And you have a lot of Turkish analysts explaining why the United States has no alternative but to work with Turkey. You can certainly make
who's right? All of them?
I mean, no, and I think these are both right. I mean, you can certainly make a very good case that rationally, the sensible thing is for both countries to continue their alliance. However, when you look at Washington, when you look at Ankara right now, you don't necessarily see enormous evidence of rational thinking prevailing. It's entirely possible that in the face of what we all, as sensible people watching this, agree would be both countries' best interests, the leaders of these countries might decide to take a different path.
Mm-hmm. Trump warned that he would obliterate Turkey's economy if it does anything, quote, off limits, while the State Department warned that the United States would impose significant costs if Turkey acted inhumanely. So this past weekend, we had this reported roadside executions by Turkey-backed rebels. That would seem to cross that line.
And there's something uniquely infuriating, uniquely ridiculous about the combination of the grandiose threats that the United States, not just Trump, but people like Senator Lindsey Graham, are making, and the absurdly vague, unspecified red lines that they're imposing that would trigger these threats to come into place. I mean, the combination makes these sanctions uniquely ineffective as a policy measure, and all the more likely to simply play a counterproductive and punitive role. It will be bad for Turkey and the United States.
If you had to place a bet, would you say that the U.S. is going to sanction Turkey for this, and what might those sanctions entail?
Look, my assumption for the past year is that while it's never clear, again, what exactly is going to trigger U.S. sanctions, what kind of sanctions will we put in place, the mounting anger in Washington is going to take some kind of expression. There are going to be some kind of sanctions. They could be extensive, they could be more limited, but my sense, my continued bet is that something is coming.
Mm-hmm. About the refugee resettlement plan, I spoke to this TRT World analyst, and he said that essentially the plan remains intact, that Turkish officials still plan to return refugees there, as many as they can, once the area is secure and stable, and once they have a chance to build some homes. Does that sound feasible to you in the light of this YPG deal with Assad?
Right. Well, this is something they were saying after the YPG deal with Assad?
Yes.
Again, it's difficult to know what to make of Turkish claims about resettling all these refugees because they've been delusional from the outset. I think there's a number of tragic elements to the way things have played out. I think the one advantage of Assad taking over this region is that this massive resettlement scheme, this massive demographic engineering is no longer going to be on the table for Turkey. The problem, the fear, the inevitable outcome of this, I worry, is that you're now going to have Turkey and possibly the European Union looking at what kind of deal they can make with the Assad regime to allow many of these refugees to go back. And that's unfortunately going to look like Assad is going to push for recognition from Turkey, going to push for recognition from the EU. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on both sides to basically agree to his terms in return for him basically not killing refugees who move back.
That's interesting. And that allows for European funding for Erdogan's plan to build these cities.
No, I don't think it would necessarily allow for European funding for Erdogan's plan to build these cities. I think it would involve both Erdogan, or I worry it would involve both the EU and Erdogan working with Assad, and that it wouldn't be Turkish-built cities in Syria. It would be Syrians returning to regime-held territory.
Not to a Turkey-controlled safe zone. Okay.
Right, exactly.
Interesting. Okay. I think that's all I've got. Anything else you'd like to say, you'd like to comment on that I've missed?
No, it's just.
I'm happy you did say that. Like this plan seems a bit delusional. Just the logistics of Turkey's refugee resettlement plan always seemed ridiculous. You clear a vast area of mixed democratic makeup filled with anti-Turkish presence and bands of rebels, keep tens of thousands of captured ISIS fighters under wraps, bring in hundreds of Turkish construction workers and materials, and then finally transfer 1 million or 2 million people there, even though a good percentage of them may not want to go. You know?
Right, aren't from there, don't want to go there, don't have jobs there. It's really... No, I mean, to see these, graphically engineered pictures that they were publishing in Daily Sabah just gave it it was a sick joke.
But now you're saying the twist may be that they agree. Because the numbers of refugees leaving Turkey for Greece, for the EU this summer has ticked up considerably because of Idlib. Now perhaps because of this it will again. So the EU presumably will have some impetus to find a deal with Turkey and perhaps Assad.
Right, and as Assad, and with Russian backing, keeps putting more and more pressure on Idlib, and you have the risk of even more refugees, actually leaving Syria and coming to Turkey, I just worry the pressure to come to terms with Assad will grow.
Okay.
No, I guess my final thought would be that there is something really tragic about the way this played out at the end. There were serious policy mistakes made, obviously by the U.S. government, obviously by the Turkish government, some deep miscalculations by the YPG, PYD forces as well. At the end of the day, you have everyone making mistakes. And, I think in the long run, you're going to see, all sides pay a penalty for their mistakes, not in proportion to how foolhardy they were, but in proportion to their pre-existing geopolitical power. I mean, the bulk of the suffering will be done by Kurds in northeastern Syria. Turkey's economy will entirely likely pay the price for Erdoğan's miscalculations. And Trump and his team, his Syria team, whose miscalculations also, helped create this disaster. At the end of the day, they're not going to be the ones who pay the price.
Well, maybe by getting kicked out of office, who knows what will happen next year. But speaking of mistakes, though, in Syria policies, there's kind of been a trend to blame Obama administration for making this deal with the YPG. One could certainly argue that the deal has been a significant success since the YPG has been the lead fighting force against ISIS and, essentially defeated it, and that there weren't really any alternative actors to partner with at the time. So did you see that as an error, a mistake in judgment at that time? Or is it, looking back, is it now?
No, that's a good question, right? Because there's been a lot of retroactive arguing about this. As a historian, I actually think there's some benefit in going back and reviewing a lot of these decisions and fighting over them. Look, Obama's decision to support the YPG, it came as a result of the failure to work with Turkey. Independent of whose fault it was, independent of whether this was Turkey's fault or America's fault, it was certainly clear that working with the YPG was going to infuriate Turkey. This was going to take a toll on the U.S.-Turkish strategic relationship. At the same time, yes, Obama sowed the seeds for what happened now. I don't think what happened now was inevitable when Obama started this policy. It's worth remembering that when Obama began arming the YPG, Turkey was in negotiations with the PKK. Turkey was inviting PYD, YPG leaders to Ankara. Turkey was working with the YPG, PYD. This was before Turkey's coup attempt. This was before anti-American hostility in Turkey reached the level that it's at now. I do think this inevitably would have caused tensions with a more sensible long-term thinking on the part of Turkey, on the part of Washington, and also on the part of the YPG. You could have had this work out in a way that was actually good for the U.S., good for Turkey, and good for the YPG, instead of the way it worked out, which is mostly just good for Assad and Russia.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much for your time, Nicholas Danforth.
Thank you for having me on.